You might be overwhelmed a little bit because we have a small window of time and I have a lot of ideas that I'm really excited to share with you today. So a little bit about me. I'm Felicity Ford, also known as Felix. I am a practicing artist for over 20 years. I am a doctor of sound art, which means, unfortunately, it's not a very useful doctor. If anyone gets sick, I can't help, but I will be able to find a good sound for that situation. I work mostly with knitting and sounds, and I am an author and a teacher, and my main focus for about the last decade has been teaching people creative strategies for stranded colourwork design. So probably if I was doing my LinkedIn profile, I should say I'm good with colours, but I never describe myself as being good with colours because I think that sets up this idea that you can be good at creativity or bad at creativity. And I'm not sure that that's really true. I don't think there's an innate goodness at being creative or goodness at being good with colours. I think it's much more that I've always been interested in colours, and I am at this point extremely experienced at working with colours. And I want to talk about experience because that is something that we can all access. And I want to share a lot of my experiences of playing with colours and working with colours with you. Like I said, there's going to be a lot of ideas. You don't have to remember them all, but hopefully one or two will sit with you and inspire you and give you something to play with and a way in to working with colours. So things I would say I'm good at and things I try and practice all the time: being curious, celebrating everyday life, allowing mistakes, playing, very important and underrated, generosity, laughing when things go wrong, essential, and practicing. And I always describe myself as a practicing artist. I hope I never get to the point where I finished practicing because then there'll be nothing left to do. So these are my strategies for experiencing joy when playing with colour and also for experiencing joy in life. And the title of this talk, Overwhelmed, or Overjoyed rather than Overwhelmed, has really come about because so many times when I'm teaching workshops, people say, I love colours, but I don't know where to start. I'm really overwhelmed. There's too many options. I don't know where to begin. And so I wanted to share my experiences so that hopefully some of that overwhelm can disappear and you can just find a joyous way in. So the first experience that I want to tell you about is called No Such Thing as Egg Colour. And this is one of my earliest and most important memories and experiences of playing with colour. I was a very precocious little teenager and I wanted to learn how to paint with oil paints. And I knew that I wasn't going to be able to do that at school for a few years. So I saved up my pocket money and I found a local artist, Pat Franco, and I said, teach me how to paint with oil colours because I want to blend all the colours and make amazing paintings. And I went to her house and I was super excited and said, we're going to do colours, we're going to do all the things. And she presented me with the most boringest thing in the world, or so I thought, a basket of eggs. And I looked at this eggs and I was like, you are kidding me. I've come here to learn about colours and it's just one basket of eggs. And she said, right, we're going to mix up the colours and I want you to get a palette knife and I want you to mixy on your palette knife and then hold the palette knife up next to the eggs and check the colours. And I was like, this is very easy, I know what I'm doing, mixy. And I went, look, finished, I made the egg colour. And she came over very gently, very kindly, guided my arm, held up the palette knife and said, can you see that colour that you've made anywhere in that basket of eggs? I could not see it. It was not there. And it was like, really the most absorbing afternoon I think I've ever had. I went from going, I know what colour the egg is, to what colour is the egg? And so it doesn't look great in this picture, but hopefully you can see many different shades of browns and peaches and beiges and greens and yellows and golds and whites. And I think it was the most focused I was as a teenager was painting the eggs. And if you take nothing away from this talk, please remember this one story. And the reason I've given you all a tester strip is because I would encourage you all, whatever the tester strip is that you've got, your job is to find matches for those colours, and you will be amazed at where you find the colours that are on your tester strip. And that lesson to hold the palette knife up and look at what is the colour next to it isn't about necessarily getting the colour right or being good with colour or being perfect with colour. It's about stretching those muscles in analysing hue and value and how dark and how hot and how cold and how light a colour is. And you can get all of them. You can go into the paint shop and say, I am feeling very indecisive. And they can't say no. Ask me how I know. So I'm going to be jumping around a little bit. I'm not going to just be saying, and then I did this, and then I did this, and then I did this, because I wanted to present everything as an idea that you can use. And one of the experiences I want to talk about is how to make plans for playing with colour that are actionable. And I want to talk about this. This is the Jamesons of Shetland shade card. It's one of the most beautiful things in the entire universe. And when I was writing up my doctoral thesis, I was writing and reading all this very stressful stuff about theories of sound. And then to try and unwind so I could go to sleep, I would take out the catalogue and I would look at the colours and I would think about a fantasy knitting project that I'm going to make that's going to be about the sea, and it's going to use all the sea-themed colours. And I would make short lists of about 70 colours that were going to end up in this project. And I never made that project because it was not actionable and it was very overwhelming. And if you go into something like a shade card or a yarn shop with a vague idea that's not actionable, you'll never knit it. However, you can get help with colours from your favourite things. And if you have an object which brings together the family of colours that you're interested in exploring, then use that object to help you. So this is a pair of socks that I made in my early 20s when I was rediscovering knitting, and I bought this variegated yarn and I was like, this is amazing. It looks like the sea, it has all the colours of the sea in it, and it's a Lorna's Laces yarn, and I think it's called Seashore. And I thought the colours work so nicely in this yarn, and they work so nicely in the sock, that possibly if I use that as an organising principle, then I can deal with the Jamesons shade card. And so then, after putting together a palette, using the help of my lovely little socks, I finally made my amazing fantasy knitted sea-inspired stranded colourwork. But I didn't do this from looking at balls of yarn. I did this from looking at the sock and letting it teach me what the colours are. Another thing that overwhelms us when we're trying to do creative things is the terror of making something ugly. But I think we should all make terrible colour combinations with absolutely no shame. So as a case in point, I present the Listen hat. I don't have the actual hat anymore, I frogged it. I'd love to tell you there was a plan for the colours. There was not a plan for the colours. There was an idea. I wanted to make a hat. It was going to say "Listen" in big letters, and then the idea kind of ran out. And I think what happened was I had a load of Alice Starmore yarns, and I was like, can't choose which one, I'll just use all of them. But the thing is that I learnt so much from doing that. I learnt that you can't go in with like, my idea is it's going to say listen, there'll be a squiggly sound wave, and then I'll do some stuff and decrease, and then we'll call it a hat, because then you'll end up with something that you don't like and you can't wear. But I also learned the gaps in what I knew that needed to be filled. And I also learned that if you do like life stitch, where you're just doing 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1 all the way around, hopefully you understand what I mean. You're basically mixing all the colours up and you're just making a mud. So I did learn some useful things. I learned I really wanted a hat. I need some more plans of how I'm going to organise the colours, and I need some help with how I'm going to do that. And I would always say one of the ways to be overjoyed rather than overwhelmed is to embrace the idea of fixing colour mistakes as something that is much, much easier than trying to get perfect combinations the first time around. So obviously I knew in the Listen hat that I didn't like the way that the colours looked. And as I was learning, I realised I need help with putting those combinations together. But the impulse to make something that spoke deeply to my love of listening and sound, and to say it in stranded colourwork, was still there. I just needed to find the way into that. So I wasn't really dismayed with the Listen hat. I had a good laugh about it, and I parked it as like something to fix later. And when things go wrong, they're just a future project for you to do. And a few years later, I made this. This is my favourite swatch I've ever knitted. I think I might have, I've got quite a lot of things here for you to see afterwards. But this swatch is based on my little handheld digital recorder. It's an Edirol R09, for anyone who wants to know. And all the patterns that are on this swatch were found in that object. And the process of sitting with that object and thinking about all the things I recorded with it, all the sounds that it documented for me, all the times I'd held it in my hand, the muscle memory of it, says something so profound about listening, so much more profound than just some massive letters, listen with a poorly planned colour combination. And much like with the eggs, when you first look at it, it just looks like this is a black plastic digital consumer product. I can't find anything in there. But the more you look at it, you realise the transport buttons are a pattern. The way that the settings are organised on the back, high mic gain, stereo, not mono, is a pattern. The glowy red button, the little digital display saying how much batteries you've got, is a pattern. And so now if I ever go back to the Listen hat, all the information that was missing in the first version is now here in this swatch. And I could knit that hat again and it would be amazing, but I couldn't have knit this if I didn't knit that first experimental, joyous object which captured the impulse to celebrate listening in sound, in knitting. Respect and document process. This is really important as part of the joy of enjoying colours rather than being overwhelmed by them. So often we don't see the process. In about 2007, I saw this. This is like the centre section of Alice Starmore's Fair Isle, Book of Fair Isle Knitting. And shout out to Alice Starmore, because without her book and this super inspiring section, I would not do what I do. And I looked at this and I went, I want to do that. That's amazing. Look at this. And you can see, hopefully, there's a tam up in the top corner that's inspired by bits of clover that are pushing up through the tarmac. There's like incredible colours on the right and this sort of glowy, melty, shimmery pattern like only Alice Starmore can do, inspired by a random profusion of wildflowers. And I looked at this and I thought, I get it. I've been to art school. I've learned about the egg colours. I can do this. I know what I'm doing. And I saw this. This is her shells. And then the chart that's inspired by the shells and the colours. And I was just itching to go. And I was visiting New Lanark Mill up in Scotland. And I was walking around the outside of the mill and I saw little blueberries growing everywhere. And I thought, I went inside the mill and I was like, there's a yarn that's the colour of the blueberries, there's like greens that are the colours of the greenery. It's right here. I'm going to make a hat that celebrates blueberries, and it's going to be inspired by this place, knitting wool from this place. And I made this hat, which I looked at and I thought, there is some stuff that happens between the photo and the knitting that I do not understand. And I wanted that space, I wanted that process, I wanted to understand how do you start with the photo and then end up with the knitting. And one of the best ways to learn how to do something and to get out of your own way is to commit to teach a workshop on that subject in 6 months' time. So I have been doing loads of stuff around knitting and sound and provenance, and I was invited to Shetland Wool Week, and Misha Hay, who was then organising Shetland Wool Week, said, what would you like to teach? And I said, well, I would like to teach a workshop on translating everyday inspirations into stranded colourwork. And in 2013, the first quotidian colourwork workshop was held, and this is Deborah Gray, who bought this special piece of willow pattern china that she found on a beach in Shetland, and it reminded her of a dish that I believe belonged to her mother, which she brought to Shetland to bring and use in the workshop. Hurrah for commitment. And there's her beginnings of her swatch. And we had this 3-hour workshop, and I said to Deborah, I feel like there's a lot of stuff that I didn't get to say in 3 hours that I've spent the last 6 months really exploring. Do you think anybody would be interested in a book on this subject? And she said, yes, I would buy that book. And I thought of me with my socks and my listen hat and thought I could have used that book. And so I wrote the book that I wished I'd had when I wanted to begin exploring, celebrating everyday life in stranded colourwork. The Stranded Colourwork Sourcebook was made possible by 405 amazing Kickstarter backers. It changed my life. I now publish books and teach as my living, and so that came out in 2014. And in 2018, what I really wanted to do was to make a book. The first book, the Sourcebook, is all about swatching, because I think that pressure to make the thing a garment, make it something you can wear, make it something that fits, put so much squeeze on just the joy of playing with colour and learning to see in patterns. And I think it's much easier to do that separately in a swatch and then figure out how we'll plug that into the maths of a garment. So I always had it in mind that the first book, the Sourcebook, would be a book about just swatching with tons of space, and we'll figure out, future you will figure out how you can wear this. But for now, we're just going to focus on this. And that's one of my main ways of managing overwhelm. Always just focus on what can I do now rather than trying to do everything at once. And then the playbook, when the Sourcebook came out, lots of people did stuff with the ideas. Shout out to Muriel, who's here. Muriel and Yumi in Japan started an amazing project called Knitted Correspondence, making postcards that were like little swatches celebrating everyday life. Deborah made bunting flags inspired by willow pattern china. There's like all these sort of projects that spiraled off the first book. And then I made some patterns that were like, there's a shawl pattern, there's a Matryoshka doll inspired laptop cozy, tablet cozy, smartphone cozy with Matryoshka dolls in big, medium and small on them. And there's things like that. And I really thought, hopefully people have been playing with swatching and now they want some projects to plug it into. So that was the playbook, and that came out in 2018. And I'm working on an ebook at the moment that again is collaborative. So all these ideas, every time I do an idea, more ideas come. This is the joy of being overjoyed with colours. Another strategy. So 2013 was quite a scary year because I was going to Shetland, home of Fair Isle knitting, like an incredible, emplaced, beautiful, like really inspiring knitting tradition. And I was going there and I was going to teach. And I knew I wanted to find a way in because I was completely overwhelmed and intimidated by the beauty and the splendour of Fair Isle knitting. And I didn't know where to start with kind of approaching this tradition and understanding it. And I was so scared of getting things wrong and doing wrong Fair Isle. I don't mind my own patterns being wrong, but I don't want to come to this tradition and mess it up. And I was terrified of that. And so me and my friend Tom came up with this ridiculous project where we used dice rolls, because we both had the same fear. And I think if you're stuck with colours, if you're frightened, if you don't know what to do next, leave things up to chance. So we knitted, and I have the box here. This was 9 years ago, so don't ask me to explain the system that we used of crazy dice rolls. But we were like, okay, sometimes it's lots of little patterns. Sometimes it's a little pattern, then a big pattern, then a little pattern. Sometimes the shading goes dark to light together. Sometimes it goes separately. And we use dice rolls to control all of these different parameters. And in a way, it was we made a lot of horrific knitting. And I have to say, the Fair Isle knitters of Shetland were not terribly impressed with what we'd done. But it reminds me of sometimes when you're really scared of something and you don't understand how it works, you have to take it apart to understand how this bit connects to this bit, connects to this bit. And sitting down and making a really complicated dice game about how Fair Isle works taught me so much about light and shade and pattern and how you sequence colours. And yeah, we made some horror show knitting that you can look at afterwards if you like. I have the box and I have the kind of the dice rolls, and I have the sounds that we were listening to when we were making the swatches. Which sort of brings me, like sometimes rules weirdly give us a kind of freedom. And so the dice rolls were kind of a way of imposing limitation on what we did. Because if you look and you're like, okay, you can use any of the colours, you can use any of the patterns, you can be inspired by anything in the Shetland Museum and Archives, you are not going to do anything because you'll just be standing there going, there's too many things, where do I even start? Whereas like, okay, we're going to use a dice to pick the pattern, we're going to use a dice to pick the colours, we're going to use a dice to organise things, kind of sets up a framework. And I think limitation is such an underrated way to avoid overwhelm. And I want to show you this amazing, this is a stocking that was knit in Kiknu, which is a tiny little island off Estonia. And I love this stocking so much. And I'm so glad that the knitters of Kiknu never had the Jameson's shade card or the Jameson and Smith shade card, because we would not have this incredible emplaced knitting. So the white and the very dark brown come from the Kiknu sheep that is grown in the island, especially for the colours of its wool. The red comes from ladies' bed straw, which is related to madder, but it's not, like it has much, much smaller roots. So it's really finicky and fiddly and annoying to harvest, and you need loads of it to get red. So it's used very sparingly and it's very precious. The yellow comes from the birch trees that grow all over the island. The tiny gauge is because this was not knitted for trade. This was like your CV, like I'm going to get married. I am really, really good at knitting. I can crochet you stuff, I can knit you stuff, and women in Kiknu, traditionally, I'm talking about the 1800s, would make a trousseau that was like this, that was like incredibly fine gauge, using these only locally available materials. There's a tiny bit of indigo that would have been traded with merchants who came to the island via sea. So this is like a map of what was there, and the incredibly limited resources of what was available gave rise to countless variants of this. And if you go to the museum in Kiknu, it's full of these incredible stockings. And so I just think let's make the case for limitations. Sometimes having only 5 colours available in really small amounts forces you to do something amazing. So for the last few years, I've been really interested in, let's take an everyday inspiration source, let's analyse it, let's find patterns within it, let's find colours within it, yet let's use it to inspire something. But I've become increasingly interested and in no small part inspired by John Arbon yarns and the Knit by Numbers colour range, in approaching things in a much more systemic way. So instead of trying to make like a picture where I'm picking and micromanaging every single piece of, so the example I've got here is the cherry blossom shawl. And apologies if this is a bit repetitive for anyone who's in my class this morning, but this was in the playbook, and it was my attempt to speak in stranded colourwork to the way that light comes through a cherry blossom tree, and you get all these different lights and darks. And so you'll see every flower that appears in this shawl has a different shading sequence. So some of them are really highly contrasting against the background. Some of them it's low contrast. Some you've got a light blue and a light pink and so on. And I love that idea of light playing with petals. But I thought when you're working with a yarn range, you're always limited by what the yarn range can do. And with Jameson and Smith 2-ply jumper weight, which I adore as a yarn, there are definitely gaps, so that if you want to go from like dark blue all the way through to light blue, there'll be some jumps. But this is not the case with the Knit by Numbers yarn. So you can see on the right is the same motif, but instead of thinking in terms of let's micromanage every version of the flower, and we're going to go light and dark and light and dark, and we're going to be sitting there with our knitting basket and our chart and thousands of tiny balls of yarn. How about if we just have, here's my pinks and here's my blues, and I'm going to just swap them in and out in a rhythm, and think about that idea of light and shade as being something that's spread through the length of the garment rather than from one flower to the next. And so I've been thinking a lot about the other thing that I have to talk about in terms of limitations is, as a knitwear designer, people are not interested in you saying, I've made a hat pattern, you need 76 colours. If someone says, will you come and do a workshop? It's like, yes, I need 400 shades of this, or I need 70 balls of this. And so in the last few years, I've thought, in a way, that limitation of like what makes sense has kind of guided some of my decisions. So like with the flambre set, which is that hat, the cowl and the mittens, you get 12 mini skeins, one in one colour, one set in one colour, one set in another colour, and it will knit you the whole thing, the hat and the cowl and the mittens. I don't think I ever costed up what you need to make this, but it is quite a lot of yarn, and I will be in trouble with some knitters who are going to be left with a big ball because they only used it for 3 rounds. So those economic limitations, instead of seeing them as like, oh, I'm so crushed by capitalism, instead it's like, well, how can I do something useful with that? And I've never tested more with this than last year, where very excitingly Knitstars, which is a huge online it's like a knitting masterclass series, and every year there's a different theme, and you buy the whole series, so you get like 11 masterclasses, and it's all online. And they sent round to film me the same people who filmed Nigella, which was amazing. It was really like this massive thing to be invited to Knitstars, and they said, who would you like to partner with yarn? And I started immediately to think in a very systematic, limited way. I was like, well, obviously I would like everyone who signs up to my Knitstars class to have like 400 colours. And I was like, no, this won't work as kits. No one wants this much yarn, and it will be unworkable for me. So I started thinking, okay, what's my class going to be? What am I interested in? I'm interested in celebrating life in stranded colourwork, very interested in feminism, very interested in women artists. I'm going to make a cowl, and it's going to have 12 sections, each of which will celebrate a different woman artist in stranded colourwork. And there's going to be 3 palettes, and each palette is going to be inspired by a woman artist. So I came up with these palettes, inspired by Alma Thomas, who's an incredible abstract painter, Georgia O'Keeffe, also incredible abstract painter, and Bobby Baker, my favourite British artist, who has done a lot of work around, she has a book called Redeeming Features of Daily Life, and she has a lot of performances that are looking at things like housework and raising kids and the health system and mental health. And anyway, she's my hero. So that's the short version. Everyone go and look at these artists because they're amazing. But I knew I had this it was this weird time pressure of like, okay, I have to give this workshop. The workshop's going to be filmed in the summer. I have to make up kits and they have to be the correct colours and everything needs to work. Like when people's kits arrive and they start knitting this, it has to work. So it was quite a lot of pressure, but it was also a framework that made me really have to think about everything I know about colour. And I did put these palettes together. I did design the cowl. You can see all the samples here later. And you can see they're all the same cowl, but knit in a different palette. But within each one, the colour relationships remain fairly consistent. So they're the same design, but one is like dual tone, purpley, greeny, kind of bluey colours. One is like earth tones, like browny, blue, like a kind of ochre yellow and an earthy green. And one is bright Alma Thomas inspired colours. And when I put these together, I want to be really clear that putting these palettes together, I was able to do it not because I'm good with colour, but because I am experienced and I've knit all this stuff, including the crazy aleatoric Fair Isle project, that's really taught me how these colours are going to interact with each other. Which brings me to my final point about how to be overjoyed rather than overwhelmed when playing with colour, which is the morning of me putting these palettes together was just time ticking. This has got to be done. Sonia needs the email from you, Felix, saying what the colours are. You need the palette. And so I just sat down in a small window of time and I pulled open the Alma Thomas book and I opened it and I had my shade card and I went, okay, I need 3 kind of red colours. I need 3 yellowy colours. I need 3 blues and I need 3 greens. And I need some really high contrast in that palette so we can do really bold ideas, and I need some really subtle things that will give knitters lovely possibilities to blend between shades. And I did that for all of them in a morning in between doing other stuff. And it was not the fantasy thing that I built up in my mind of like Felix's special creative time to play with colour. And I have to continually remind myself not to wait for special time to play with colour, because we always think that doing something creative, oh, I need like 2 days for that, or like, oh, I need like to go on a retreat or something. There's no 2 days, there's no retreat. In all the years of playing with colour, I have to say so much of it has been done by the seat of my pants to a crushing deadline. And I really think that that's one of the most important things. So yesterday, in between writing this talk, it's getting up to do little breaks. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to organise these tomatoes in this bowl. I'm going to go from the like most yellowy one right the way through to the most red one. And I'm going to really think about, is that one a bit more green? Is that one a bit more yellow? And I do stuff like this all the time, waiting for the kettle to boil, waiting for my bit of toast while I'm waiting for the rice. It's a lot of cooking. Love food. But there's always like these very everyday possibilities. Do not be stingy with yourself, thinking that you have to wait for some magic window of time to play. The only time we have to play is right now. And so I'm just gonna, I also had a slightly panicked moment yesterday where I went, is the shading thing gonna work? If I give everyone the shade card, are they just gonna think I'm weird? Is it gonna work? And I pulled one out at random, held it up to the wall of where I'm staying, and I was like, no, it's definitely gonna work. And I found, just as I was like thinking, I looked at this apple and I thought, that's a nice green apple. And then I looked through my tester strips, and the lesson of there is no egg colour continues to be relevant, because this is definitely golden fern number 1 and not a shade of green. And I think that's the main thing in how to be overjoyed rather than overwhelmed when playing with colour, is to just relax. You'll never know the answer. Just keep looking, because that's where the joy is. Okay, I think that's a good note to end on. I hope you've enjoyed my talk.
So when you're charting up, you've got an idea for the shape of your pattern. So is it just ordinary graph paper and crayons or felt tip pens, and you can get the ball rolling?
You know, good question. When I first started charting, I sat down and I got all my coloured pencils, and I got the special knitter's graph paper, and I went in and coloured in everything. And I realised really quickly that it's actually a barrier. If you've ever drawn anything or been like a visual artist, that's a huge barrier, because you start trying to make a picture and you run into all sorts of constraints, like my house is here, my tree is here, the sun is here, there's a strand of 75 stitches here. And so I tend now to just chart very on the fly with just a plain HB pencil, and I use, oh, where's it gone? I use just a dot grid notepad. So it's got a grid, but it's very faint, and I can just sort of sketch out ideas and then begin. So like I'll just take the rough shape, draw it, and then colour in every square next to it. And I always just start with the shape now and try as quickly as possible to think about, to turn it into a chart. And I try and do that separately than thinking about colour. I do think about colour after that, but not when I'm just getting the shape. Does that help?
So just basically have black and white.
Yeah, totally black and white on, on dot grid paper.
Yeah, then you can play around the colours and have a shape after.
Exactly. And I was saying in the workshop this morning, that's what's really helped me, the more and more I've worked with this medium, is to get away from this idea of, I'm going to put a touch of pink here, and I'm going to put a bit of blue here, and I'm going to put a bit of yellow here. And instead to think pattern, background, I've got 2 channels, and I'm going to pour colour into them. So one of them is going to be like a river of oranges and browns and greens, and then this one's going to be blues and whites. And that really helps to get over the overwhelm of like looking at the chart and trying to figure out what colour goes where before you've even finished the idea.
Yeah. Also, you've got charts and things that you can download from the internet now as well, just to play around with shapes, so it can really create those.
Yeah. Welcome. Does anybody else have any questions?
Are your books e-books?
Sorry?
Are your books physical or are they electronic?
So the playbook and the sourcebook and the playbook colouring companion are all physically printed books that you can order, and I will ship them to you. But you can also buy them digitally. They're all both on Ravelry and on my own shop that I think is shop.knitsonic.com. And the book that I'm working on at the moment is an ebook, because it's focused a lot on colouring in, and it's actually, what I've found is that people buy my colouring book that I printed, and then they download the digital one and print out the pages so that they don't spoil the colouring book. So I was like, I'm not doing that. So the ebook at the moment, which is called the Knitsonic and Friends Colour to Knit ebook, I just love a catchy title, that's all going to be an ebook, and that comes out in August, with the idea that there's some stuff that's helpful to print out and some stuff you don't need to. You can just check on your phone or computer. Or.
But you won't be the only ones in hard copies. Mine are by my bed. If I had a grotty day, I could just bask in them.
Oh, well, I'm very happy that they can be a joyous pre-bedtime read.
And you didn't bring any with you?
No, not to, it's always, no, they're just the logistics of trying to work out how many books should I bring and how heavy they be, and then they're stupid prices like $18.99 and $19.99, and people are like, can you break a 50? No. So, I haven't got any here, but.
This morning, the lady who's with the big book display out there outside.
Oh, does she?
Or go to your website.
Or you can go to my website and I will personally ship the book to you.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Did anyone else think that by pure chance they got the best one of the whole set?
I'm very fond of mine.
I feel like you're done. I mean, you just hold it up to the room and.
I was going to say, yeah, you can tell.
Your ladies' bracelet, everywhere.
You can take another one if you want. Okay. Well, I'm around for a little bit. Thank you all so much for being a lovely audience, and thank you for coming to my talk.